invite you to remain standing for our scripture reading. We'll be reading from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 9. Let's read God's good word together. As he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. As we prepared to set out for 2 weeks in the wilderness, my best friend John and I drove about 4 hours south of Salt Lake City to a compound outside of Boulder, Utah, and we met 9 people that we would be spending the next 2 weeks with that we had never met. None of them had ever met each other. We were the only ones who knew someone who was on the trip. But as you know, whenever you get into a new social situation, you start to size people up. And you try to figure out, is this a group of people that I can fit in with? Are these people I might be friends with? In 2 weeks, am I going to want to still talk to them, or am I going to wish that we had not gone together? Is this someone who is going to take more than their share of food, and I'm going to be stuck with what's left? If we happen upon a mountain lion, will they be helpful? Am I faster than them? Like all of these kinds of questions. So we started to kind of figure it out, and we went around and shared our stories and what had brought us there. But whenever we come into those situations, you start to wonder, is this a group of people that I can belong with? Is this a place where I can fit in? Sometimes is this a place that I can work to my advantage? Can I get something out of these relationships? Or where do I fit in the pecking order? Can I be in this group of people? Or are these people below me? Are they above me? Where is my place? Where do I fit? And that's the question that we're talking about today, the question of community. How do we come together into a place where we belong? How can we find a place where we belong, the place where God invites us to be, and how can we become that kind of community together? And so we've been going through our sermon series the last 4 weeks. We've been talking about surviving the wilderness, how we can leave comfort to find life. I've been sharing about the 2 weeks that I spent in the wilderness with not very much technology, a wool blanket and a poncho and a knife and not a lot else, and a camera, so I could show you all photos. And that was the only really digital technology that we had. But we've been looking also at the stories in the Bible of the wilderness and how God meets people there. And here's the thing, is we will all find ourselves in the wilderness one way or another. And whenever we find ourselves in those moments, we need to be ready so that whenever something is taken from us, something that we rely on, that we won't just be lost without it. How can I go forward without something that I've relied upon? And so in week 1, we talked about the practice of fasting, of having food taken away from us, because fasting helps us to realize what's really driving us. Whenever you are hungry, whenever you don't have that crutch anymore, you find things out about your character that you didn't know. And whenever you're hangry, you learn about how you really are. And that's because whenever we get rid of the inessential, we can actually focus on what matters most. That's one of the benefits of fasting. That's one of the things that we learned in the wilderness. We spent the first 54 hours without any food, doing a lot of hiking up and down, in and out of canyons. And so we learned some things about ourselves. And fortunately, everyone passed the test, and we didn't decide that we wanted to kick anybody off the island, so to speak, during that period. And in week 2, we talked about the fact that many of us are trying to live superhuman lives. We're trying to go beyond our human limitations, to do everything at work and to achieve at high levels, to have great social relationships, and also to have good work-life balance and to keep up with laundry and dishes as well, right? And how's that going for everyone? Wonderful. We're all doing an amazing job of it and keeping up with our email too. No, we are dependent people. We have limitations. And whenever we forget that, then we're lost, because God created us to rely upon God and upon one another. And so whenever we do things like eat and drink, our daily need for food and for water and for air, they remind us of our dependence on God and for the earth that God made, for the world that God made for us. And we experienced that in the wilderness whenever we found out that our next meal was coming from a ram that we had to kill and then process and then cook. And so it was a lot different than going to the supermarket and getting some meat that came in a plastic tray. And but we recognized our dependence, that that's not where food comes from, at least not initially. And so we recognized that we are dependent on God for everything that we have. Then last week we looked at Jesus' ministry and how he had this rhythm of he would be with people, he would do ministry and heal and teach, and then he would withdraw for solitude. And then he would come back and re-engage with people and withdraw again. He had this rhythm of being with people and withdrawing to solitude. And he wasn't out to become a hermit, and he also wasn't with people all the time, but he had this rhythm. And this is how Henry Nouwen puts it. He doesn't really mince words. He says, without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. We do not take the spiritual life seriously if we do not set aside some time to be with God and to listen to him. It's absolutely critical. And of course, can you think of a relationship that you can say, I take this relationship seriously if you don't set aside time to be with the person and to listen to them? Of course not. That's not how relationships work. And it's the same with our relationship with God. We have to set aside time to listen. And that's always been a need, but it's especially a need given the kind of hyper-connected culture that we live in today. And the goal is not to become like some kind of super monk hermit that lives up on a mountain and doesn't have to talk to anyone. So sorry, introverts, if that's what you're hoping for. That's not the goal of the spiritual life. Instead, solitude enables us to come back to more fully engage with people, to become more truly ourselves so that we can be more helpful to people. It gives us solid ground so that we can stand upon, so that we can lift up our neighbors in love. And if you think about if you're floating in a pool and someone needs help and they grab onto you and try to get you to help them, where do you go? Down. But if you're on the side, then you can reach down and actually help them up if you have solid ground under your feet. That's what solitude does for us, enables us to have solid ground under our feet so that we can help others. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer says this really well, the great German martyr. He says, let him who cannot be alone beware of community. Right? Because if we don't ever have that time alone to do the kind of work that we can only do in solitude, then we're going to bring our most anxious selves into relationships. We're going to bring the parts of ourselves that we have not sought healing for, and it's not going to go well for those relationships and for those in community with us. And so he recognizes, like Nouwen, that we absolutely have to have solitude. And yet he also adds a flip side to this. What he says is, let him who is not in community beware of being alone. Because our relationships are what grounds us so that we have a sense of self whenever we do step aside into solitude. We know who we are because of the people we're in relationship with. And so that community is absolutely critical, and that's what we're looking at today, because many of us are seeking community in a very lonely culture, in a culture that's becoming more and more so as the years go by. And probably you've seen the statistics that have come out of like the Surgeon General's office about the fact that just a staggering number of people have no close friends. And if they had an emergency in the middle of the night, don't know who they would call besides 911. And so all around us, there are people who are experiencing loneliness, and most of us have, at some time or another, experienced loneliness and a desire for deeper community, a desire for relationships. And yet this culture that we live in is hyper-individualistic, and it's leading us out of community and into loneliness. And so even things like watching TV that used to be at least a family activity, like I don't have to watch what my brother wants to watch anymore because I can watch pretty much anything that's ever been produced on my phone by myself. And so this thing that was like maybe like dubiously communal, it was at least something we could do together. Now we each do it by ourselves. And so kind of as things go, we're becoming more and more individualistic, and it's isolating us more and more. A few months ago, I had the opportunity to go to a training around Ruby Bridges' work as it relates to poverty and helping people come out of poverty. And it's really great. I definitely commend her work. But one of the things that she talks about is really just kind of sociologically, this is observation, no value judgment, but she looks at what are the driving forces between people in different kind of social classes. And one of the things that she's seen is that the driving forces for families struggling in poverty is relationship. It's relationship. And so you can think about that's absolutely critical. If you do not know week to week whether you're going to get to stay in your house or your apartment, having a relationship with someone who will let you sleep on their couch is critical, right? In a way that it's not if you're financially stable. And so those relationships are really important. She says for people in middle class, which is really broad, goes up to like, I think $10 million in net worth. So I'm interested in trying out the high end of middle class. But anyway, so she defines that broadly, but she says the defining force for middle-class families is achievement. And so you go to college and get a degree because that's what's going to enable you to succeed. If you're offered a good job, you take it, even if it means moving away. And so you can see how those kind of two things could be in tension, right? Because if you take a good job and move away, then you're leaving the family behind. And so depending on which of those you value more, you may or may not make a different decision. And that's not to say one decision is necessarily better than the other. And you can even see ways in which this can hold people back, right? Maybe if you've been the first person in your family to go to college, you may have experienced people in your family who did not like that, who thought, like, you think, oh, you're better than us now, or you think you're somebody now, and you know a lot of stuff. And so you can see how that plays out. But one of the things that was really striking to me, having grown up in a middle-class family and just kind of taken for granted those kinds of values, is that putting achievement above all else makes us lonely, right? I mean, if we value achievement above relationship, then it's just going to take us away from people. And it's worth at least pausing to ask, whenever we have those things, whether that's an opportunity to go to college far away, whether that's a job opportunity that'll take you away from family, to at least ask, what am I sacrificing in order to say yes to this? Because for a lot of us, the answer to that is just assumed, right? I mean, you take the job because that's what you do, because that's what's going to enable you to achieve. That's going to enable you to provide for yourself and to provide for your family. And yet there are things that are lost if we take that for granted. And so those are things that we really have to take into consideration if we want to have relationships. And I mean, I think that's part of the reason why we see many people who are sacrificing their families for work, right? It's not that they're making a conscious decision, like saying, I'm just not going to be around for my kids because I like my work better. It's just this, I grew up where achievement is just in the water. That's what you do. That's how you live. That's what you prioritize. And if that's the case, then you are going to make those choices to stay at work because you feel like you have to, because that's where you've grown up. And so for a lot of folks, that's just kind of what you do because that's the way things are, or at least that's what we assume, because that's the culture that we grew up in. And and yet all of this emphasis on achievement is not making us happier, right? There are a lot of really successful people who are really lonely. And if you've achieved anything significant, you found that whenever you get to the top of that mountain, all you can see is other mountains that are higher than the one that you climbed up, right? Like, oh, I thought I would feel like I did something after I finished school. Now I just see these people with higher degrees or higher incomes or whatever it is. Achievement doesn't make us happy. It's also not the criteria by which Jesus judges us. He invites us into community simply by virtue of our being persons. Right? Pretty low bar, right? Are you created in the image of God? Okay, come on in. You're in. It's not like, okay, Brandon, so like how many people responded positively to your sermon? What was the net promoter score of people as they left church last week, right? He's not asking that question like, I don't know, if you're a 7 or below, that's not going to cut it, Brandon. I'm sorry. Like you're not in. You can't come to church this week, right? That's not how Jesus works. And yet for many of us, it feels like we're fighting so hard for our acceptance. We have to achieve certain things, even if, whether that's in the workplace or in our families, we have to run things in a certain way for ourselves to be acceptable to God. And yet that's not Jesus' standard. Jesus is like, are you breathing? Okay, that's my breath. Come on in, right? You're my family. And he invites us in. And this is what he says in the Great Commission. He says, go therefore and make disciples of which nations? All of them, not the ones that we like, not the people who are like us, not the ones who have a certain level of per capita GDP, all nations. Invite all of them in, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. He invites everyone into his family and invites all of us into community to have the kind of relationships that we dream about, that we're longing for in a lonely society. And that's one of the things that we got to experience in the wilderness with these people who came from all kinds of places. We had people from both coasts, I think one person from Canada, and really across the socioeconomic spectrum too. Some people who were doing things that I don't even really understand, but that require a lot of capital to be able to engage in. And some people who had just finished school and didn't really have anything. And so it was just really interesting to be in this group of people who came from all these different backgrounds, and yet there was this community that was formed as we had the experiences that we had and as we engage in campfire conversations. And if you've been camping, if you've been around a bonfire or a campfire, there's something about being gathered around a fire that you can have different conversations than you would normally have. right? Sometimes you can just engage with people at a greater level of depth than you can whenever the fire is not present. And so that was how we spend a lot of our evenings, was around the fire. During the day, we were learning about navigation and hiking, and so how to read a topographical map and all those great things. But we'd hike all day during the day, and we'd get pretty worn out, and then whenever we got to the place we were staying, we'd make camp and get our shelters ready, and then we would start fires. And so we would just gather around the fire like that, and the philosophy of the school that I was a part of was positive impact. So leave no trace wasn't really possible with kind of the level of technology that we had and the length of time that we were in the wilderness, but instead we knew we were going to make an impact, so we wanted it to be a positive one. And so one of the things that we did was whenever we made fires, we either found a fire pit or we would make really small fires, because if you're making big fires and burning large pieces of wood, it leaves coals, and so that has an effect on the environment. And so what we do is they told us we could only burn wood that was the diameter of our finger or less, which is pretty small. It also means you're spending a lot of time breaking up wood and then feeding the fire. And so you can see this pile of wood by my new friend Eric. I guess he's old at this point. 6 months old. Anyway, he was new at the time. And so we just gather this sagebrush and we'd bring it in, and then one person would have to just like be kind of breaking it and getting it ready, and someone else would be sitting there and actually feeding it into the fire, making sure the fire didn't go out, and then somebody else would be like cutting up vegetables. This was the stew that we would have every night. It was lentils and quinoa and some vegetables, but that's what we'd eat. And so we spent a lot of time just doing that, because it takes a long time to make a fire that way, and it took about an hour for the stew to cook, and so we had a lot of time just sitting there and having these conversations. We also got to enjoy some new delicacies that I had never had. Has anyone had an ash cake before? I know it sounds really appetizing. Basically, just we got some flour and some water, and you make just this little, almost like a tortilla, and as the name says, you would throw it in the ashes and just let it cook. And you try to brush off what you could. It was still a little crunchy, but whenever you're running a caloric deficit every day for 2 weeks, you eat pretty much whatever's in front of you. And so we did that. Some of the people got really creative. We had like some sugar and powdered milk that we'd use for breakfast. They put some water in it and actually made like frosting, and they called what they had cinnamon rolls. I don't think we had cinnamon. Maybe somebody snuck it in. It was contraband. But anyway, so we got creative, but I mean, just this kind of things that were just popping up because we were spending time around the fire, having these conversations, and these people who came from around the country, from vastly different walks of life, became a community. And I think you know how this works. Many of life's most important moments take place around the table. And so you think about the kind of things that happen. What do you do at these milestone moments? You share a meal. If it's a holiday, you share a meal. If it's a birthday, you have food together. This is our family at Christmas last year. My mom and my siblings and their significant others and our kids, that we've added one since this was taken, and we'll have one more in about a month. But, you just get to spend time together and a kind of quality of time that you don't get normally. We took this one several years ago. You can see baby Elsie on the left. She's maybe 2 there, and she's 9 now, but sitting with her Aunt Amanda and great-grandma Betty. And just that kind of time across generations is not something we get a lot of. I'm guessing you don't get a lot of that either. And you can see a slightly older Elsie, or maybe it's just the braid in her hair, but she's sitting with my sister and my cousin and his wife and their baby, Wyatt. One of the things I noticed, we don't take a lot of photos of meals in my family, I guess because we're like eating, but anyway, this was the best I could do. And that's Courtney's family from, I think, this last year and maybe 2 years ago. And then just the kind of things that you get to do. So my daughter's with their cousin Lottie on the left, making cupcakes for everybody and decorating it with dancers, because my mom is a dance teacher, and that's what we do. But just these moments that you make, and it was reinforced for me this weekend. So I wrote the sermon like on Wednesday, and then we went to the lake and at a rented lake house, and I found this: the best memories are made around the table. So there you go, the lake house is spoken. And whenever the lazy Susan speaks, you have to incorporate it. I felt like I had to share that with you because it obviously was made to be. I don't know why the lazy Susan was on a coffee table, and so I don't know. Anyway, maybe they actually had coffee on it and just, okay, does someone need creamer? Yeah, here you go. Anyway, And then you make memories, having conversations about why there's a lazy Susan here and what possibly could have led to this. But one of the things that you see throughout Scripture is that a lot of it deals with food. And so if you read the letters of Paul, he talks a lot about food. In the book of Galatians, he's talking about the fact that Peter has stopped eating with people who are not Jewish and how that has the potential to tear the community apart because some people are in and some people are out. Some people have access to one of the leaders and some people don't. And so he talks about why that's so important. He also spends a lot of time talking about meat from animals that have been sacrificed to idols, to the Greco-Roman gods. And in fact, if you take Disciple Bible Study, whenever you get to 1 Corinthians, you're like, okay, Paul, this has been like 3 chapters of you talking about meat sacrificed to idols. Like, I don't even know how I would go about doing that. Why are you talking? Like, what am I supposed to take from this? But what it was about is about how that has the potential to tear apart community. If some people can't think that that's wrong to do that and you're trying to share a meal with them, it's not going to work. And so a lot of time is spent about what enables us to come together around the table in the Scriptures. And one of the things you see as you read the Gospels is that much of Jesus' life was spent eating with people. He's just constantly eating. And I guess he walked a lot, so it worked out okay. But he spent a lot of time just being with people and sharing meals. And in the Scripture that we just read, it says, as he sat at dinner at the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. So they weren't just like present, they were sitting with him. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Because he came for which people? All of them. And he invited all of them to the table with him. He was creating a community where there was not less than or better than, or where some people were invited and some people were not. He's creating a community where everyone had a place at the table. And he's continuing to create that kind of community today through the church. And hospitality was a really big deal in the ancient world, partially because, they didn't have AAA. I don't know if you knew that or not. It's a relatively recent invention. They also didn't have Motel 6. And so traveling between cities, you were really potentially taking your life in your hands. And so whether or not a stranger offered you hospitality, whether they would give you a place to sleep and food and water, that could be the difference between life and death. And so it was just a part of the culture. And for a lot of us, we've kind of lost that. Certainly the stakes are not the same. But a lot of what we do now is more like entertaining than hospitality. And there's a difference. Really, I think with entertaining, it's not to say one's bad and one's good, but with entertaining, we're really trying to give someone an experience. And at least if I'm honest, whenever I'm entertaining, I'm also trying to give a certain impression about myself, namely that I pick up after myself better than I actually do. Is anyone else in that boat? You don't have to raise your hands. But whenever we entertain, we're trying to give someone an experience, to have them experience certain things. And it's beautiful, and I've been entertained by people that it's a wonderful experience. But it's different than hospitality. Whenever we practice hospitality as it's described in the Scriptures, we're sharing our lives in a deeper way that goes deeper than the things that we can experience. And in fact, if we're practicing hospitality, we might... This is a little crazy. You're going to have to go with me. We might even leave out that basket of laundry that's been sitting there for 3 days and not put it into the closet where everything else goes whenever we entertain, because we're inviting people into our real lives as we actually live them. There's a sharing of life and vulnerability when we practice hospitality that invites people to really see us beyond the mask that we try to put on for other people. It's sometimes the mask that we try to put on for ourselves. But whenever we do that, whenever we invite neighbors to our tables for a meal, it can absolutely be transformative. Certainly it was for the people who ate with Jesus, for the sinners and tax collectors who were not usually invited to those kinds of places. And now they got to sit with their Messiah and their Lord. They were invited and got to share life with him in a way that created a new community and completely transformed it. That's the kind of community that Jesus invites us into as well. And yet if we want to actually experience that, I'm sorry to say, it's going to require us to burst our bubbles. Did you know that some people in suburbia live in a bubble? I know, it was surprising to me too. But a lot of us, we end up around people who are like us. Many of our communities, most of them, in fact, are organized around affinity. And so the things we like to do, but also just the kind of people who live in the kind of places where we do. And a lot of that has to do with financial resources and with social class. And we may not have formal social classes in this country, but certainly class divisions exist. If you just look around at who has access to what, those divisions are there. And one of the most challenging things for us as Christians that we face today is figuring out how to negotiate a world where everything is for sale. Andy Crouch talks about this as the crisis of liquidity, which I wanted to work in because it's an impressive sounding word. But basically what he says is that in this world, everything can be liquidatable. It can become cash. It can become an asset. And so one way this happened, and again, it's not a judgment, it's just a description of how this is different. If you think about where our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and their grandparents lived, many of them lived on a home place that the family had lived on for generations. But for me, moving to Edmond in 2018 and buying a house, what was that primarily? It was an investment, right? I mean, you start in this level home, and then after you get some equity, then you can sell it and you move up to this kind of home. It's a different way of looking at the places that we live. And it's not just homes, but it's also our relationships. A lot of times we go into relationships and we're looking for what Arthur Brooks calls deal friends, right? People who can help us to take the next step in our career, can connect us with business opportunities or things that can help us move forward socially. We end up really in relationships that are monetizable. And that's not even to mention there are a lot of companies that are really happy to turn your friendships and your relationships into money, right? I mean, that's an entire model is, okay, Brandon knows Mark and their friends, and Brandon's on Facebook. If we can get Mark on Facebook, then that's more advertising money for us, right? I mean, that's how all of that works. And so everything, in some ways, is reducible to cash value, to what's the potential value of this financially. And so we're really challenged. We're going against the stream if we're going to be living differently. And yet, if we want to live like Jesus did, our relationships have to matter more than our social class and status, right? I mean, that's Jesus 101, because he brought together a community beyond divisions of race and gender and status and wealth. And yet the people that we end up associating with are people who are like us. And again, it's not like we're trying to exclude people who make less than we do or who are lower on the totem pole. It's just the way that we do because we have access to certain things or we like certain things. And you might think about, what are the kind of restaurants that you like to go to? And some of those you will not like to go to because they're too expensive. Some of those you won't because, they're just not, people like us don't eat in those kinds of restaurants. That's kind of the way that we're stratified. I was talking to a friend of a friend. I was talking to a friend about a friend of a friend who is a financial advisor and has a client who's just more wealthy than most of us can imagine. Approaching billionaire status. And I was talking about he didn't start that way. And so as his assets grew, he said, every time you kind of hit a different milestone, you get a new set of friends. Right? You have different friends at $1 million than you did before that, a different set of friends at 10 and 50 and 100, and it just went like that. And that didn't sound like friendship, right? But as I reflected on that, I thought, most of my friends, probably the vast majority of them, are in basically the same level, income bracket that I am, because we end up associating with people who are like us. It's not that different. There's just a different level. It's easy to judge someone who's more socially mobile than I am, but it's what we all end up doing. Jesus invites us into a community that's beyond that. This is what Paul says in Galatians. He says, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there's no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. It's a community that's totally beyond all those markers of status that we use to separate ourselves. And this next part is a little bit of a stretch. You're going to have to go with me for a second. By the way, does anybody know who wrote Romans? Did somebody tell you not to answer? Okay. It's not Paul. Paul dictated it. Tertius wrote Romans. And so there's kind of at the end of the book of Romans, it's going through greetings to various people. And this is Romans 16:22. And so Paul has just signed. He says he sends his greeting personally. He often would write those in his own hand. But then I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you in the Lord. And so he's greeting the people. Tertius, does that word sound like anything in English? It's like, the word tertiary, another one that you can sound impressive if you say. What does that mean? Like third. And so probably this is someone who has a third son. His status was so low, like he didn't even really get a name. He's just third. He's the third son. And that was it. So probably this is someone who was a slave or former slave who was actually writing down the letter. And yet what comes next is Gaius, who is host to me and the whole church, greets you. So if he's hosting, you've probably heard that in the early church, around the time that this was being written, they met primarily in house churches. Gaius owned the house. He was the householder. So he owned the house of this, probably in Corinth was where this was written. He owned the house. He was the householder. In Roman society, he was the pater familias. He was the one with status. And yet he's mentioned right next to someone who had no status. His status wasn't even enough for him to get a real name. He was just the third. And yet they're mentioned side by side because they've been brought into this new household of God. They've been brought into this new community. After that, you get Erastus, the city treasurer, so another person of status. And who comes after that? Our brother Quartus. They greet you. What do you think Quartus means? Fourth. I mean, that's even worse. He's even lower than the third. And yet they're mentioned side by side. And by the way, what does he say about Quartus? He's a brother, not a servant, not somebody we tolerate, not somebody that we keep around because it makes us look more inclusive. He's our brother. Same as Gaius, same as Tertius. They are all one in Christ. And it's pretty amazing the parts of the Bible that you tend to skip over because it's like a bunch of greetings from people I've never heard of actually tell you a lot more than you would have realized. But to have that kind of society, it's not easy. Right? I mean, you think about someone who may still be a slave in Tertius, and yet he's brothers now with Gaius, who owns everything. That's not an easy relationship. And we've got to be honest as the church and just say, we did not do well with slavery for hundreds of years. That's our history, unfortunately. And yet, at our best, we're invited into a new kind of community where we move beyond that. And yet, it's not easy. It takes navigation. We have to figure out how to navigate life together. And one of the things that's really beneficial is that whenever we have those kinds of relationships, we have people who see things differently than we do and can help us to see clearly and to make better decisions. And that's one of the things that we experience. So as we were learning about navigation, this was part of, I think, the last day that we were hiking. You can see in the back, that's Boulder Mountain. It's like 11,000 feet in elevation and the biggest mountain in the area. And so we could kind of use that to figure out direction. But as we were learning this, we were learning how to read topographical maps. And then they would say, basically, okay, you're here. By tomorrow, you need to get here. And they actually gave us like 3 waypoints. And then the guides were like, okay, we're leaving now. And you just go and we'll meet you over here in 3 days. And we're like, what if we get lost? And they said, we'll find you. And I don't really know how that was going to work. Fortunately, we didn't have to rely upon it. One of the things that I learned is that you don't point with your finger, right? Because, depending on the scale, your finger might be like 5 miles wide, right? Like, okay, what are you pointing at? You break off a piece of grass or something like that, and then use that so you can actually point, get a fine point that you're indicating on the map. But this was the map of part of the area that we were looking at, and so you can look for landmarks. Each line marks elevation, and so whenever you see circles, that's a peak. And so as we were going, we came up Sulphur Creek and then had to go down Chokecherry Creek. The unfortunate thing was there was no water in Chokecherry Creek, and so it was not as reliable a navigation guide as you would have hoped if it had water in it. But and so it says Twin Peaks here, and you can see there's kind of a peak there and there. And then you have these 3 peaks. And these 2 are a little bit higher. There's an extra circle there than this one, but you can see. And so if going back, you would look and you can kind of see these 3 peaks here. And so you kind of look back at the map and be like, okay, I think this is where we're supposed to go. So we need to go past those and then left. One of the downsides, so was when we got to these 2 peaks, is we were right here, and then you look and you can only see one of them because they're the same size. It's like, okay, I think this is it, but we can't really tell until we walk several miles. But we had to figure that out. And we also got to see Boulder Mountain. We got there right when the aspens were changing colors, and so the yellow are aspen trees, and just really beautiful. And I wish I could have brought some aspens back to Oklahoma, but I hear they don't grow well here. Anyway. But so we navigated and we hiked, and you can see some of the ground that we got to cover, and being at the back kind of reminded me of the family Von Trapp. And, at the end, climb every mountain. And I didn't sing it, but I thought about it. And maybe because I thought about it, I didn't sing it. But so we'd have two people in front. They would have a map, and they would be figuring out the course. And whenever we passed a landmark, they'd be like, okay, this looks like that, and it looks like we're headed down the right way. But then we'd have two people in the back, the sweeps, who also had a map, and their job would be to make sure nobody fell behind and that we didn't get too spread out. But then they were also double-checking every landmark that we passed and making sure, okay, that we are still on track. And sometimes they would say, like, hey, this is where you think we are is not where we actually are. And we'd have to figure out and kind of backtrack a little bit. None of those were too far, but there were times that we had to figure that out. And on the very last day, we got kind of like, should have been at the campground, we thought, and we were trying to figure that out, and we were just in a canyon, and so the canyon walls were the only landmark you could see. And eventually we walked back a mile and then forward to figure out we just hadn't gone far enough. But, you needed people to be able to say, hey, this is not where we actually want to be headed. And that's one of the beautiful things about relationships is they enable us to hear and to speak hard truths. We're able to say things like, look, Brandon, you want to be headed in this direction. You are going this direction, and you need to change that. You need to change direction if you want to actually get where you say you want to go. Also, Brandon, is that actually where you want to go, or is that just a nice thing that you like to say? We need people who can ask us those kinds of questions about the direction that we're headed in life. And it's also important that happens within a relationship, because probably you've known Christians who are really happy to tell people how they were going wrong, and there's no relationship. And typically those kind of folks are not interested in receiving correction. They just want to give it, which may be common to all of us. But the relationship is absolutely critical, and if you don't have those kinds of relationships, then you might end up in a place that you don't want to be, because you don't have anyone that you'll listen to whenever they tell you, hey, you should have turned right back there, and you've been going for about 10 miles, and you're not headed to the place that you think you're headed to, or the place that you're headed is not worth going to. We need those kinds of relationships, and that's what Paul says in Ephesians. That's what he talks about. He says, speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. And really, that's a crucial part of growing up, is being able to receive correction, to listen to people who are telling you things that you may not want to hear, but that you need to hear. And but those two words are really important. Speaking the truth in love. In love. Some people speak the truth because they want to feel better than, but we've got to speak it in love. And whenever that happens, whenever there is a relationship and there is love, then we can hear things that we can't hear from other people, and it can save us a lot of heartache. That's what happens whenever we have people in our lives who can challenge us. And we need that if we're going to make progress, if we're going to grow into the people God created us to be. Robert Mulholland talks about this really well. He says, when God begins to work with us at the deep levels of our incompleteness and brokenness, which are just the parts of our lives that we love to share with people, right? Let me tell you how broken I am. Here are all the ways that I'm a screw up. We love that. He says, our bondage and sin, we need the body of Christ to support, encourage, challenge, and nurture us toward wholeness. We need that because it is through the people that God has given us in community who help us to grow into wholeness. It's not something that we can do by ourselves. That's why Bonhoeffer says, beware going into solitude in the absence of community, because it's through relationships that the deepest part of our healing can happen. We are loved into people of love. It doesn't just happen by ourselves. No matter how many good books we read, no matter how much time we spend reading the Bible, if we're not in relationship with other people of faith, that kind of healing and wholeness does not happen. But sometimes it doesn't go the way that we want, and part of being in a relationship also means accepting that people are going to let you down. It's going to happen. And it's rough whenever it happens. Most of the time it's not intentional. Sometimes it is. And you've got to work through that. And it's really hard whenever those things don't happen. But if we have an idealized community in our head where nobody hurts each other's feelings and nobody does anything that's hurtful, then we're just going to be chasing a fantasy our entire lives. This is what Bonhoeffer says. He says, you got to love Germans. Like they just tell you how it is. He says, he who loves his dream of a community more than the Christian community itself becomes a destroyer of the latter. The person who loves their idea of the Christian community more than the community itself becomes a destroyer of it, even though his personal intentions may be ever so honest and earnest and sacrificial. If we just have this idealized picture in our head and we're always chasing that, we're never going to have an actual real relationship with real people. And part of that means sticking around when things are hard. For deep and healing relationships to take place, we have to be willing to stay. Because it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't even happen over a year. It takes time. And for many of us, we have a rough patch with someone, we get into conflict, or maybe we find out that they have political views that we don't like, and we're just out, right? We cut ties really fast these days, partially because we can. We live in a more individualistic culture. We're not as reliant on one another, and so we're just out. But if we want to have relationships that actually lead to the kind of healing that Jesus is inviting us to, we have to stay. Now, I'm not talking about situations of abuse. We need to cut those ties whenever that's happening. But for just normal conflicts and even seeing things differently, which is going to happen if we're in relationship with people who are different than us, we have to be willing to stay because that's where the grace of God is at work. And we need those because those deep spiritual friends, they can remind us who we are and whose we are whenever we forget. And I realized whenever I got back how quickly it is to readjust. One of the things that was cool is whenever we went out into the wilderness, it was just like after day 2, it was like, okay, I sleep outside now. Like this is just my life, right? I mean, shelter is not really a thing that I worry about. And so you adjust faster than you think. But then whenever you get back, you also adjust faster than you think. And so I didn't have access to my phone for 2 weeks. It was glorious. The only thing that I missed was I couldn't call Courtney and our girls. That was rough. But aside from that, it was amazing not having a phone. And yet whenever I got back, what did I want to do? I wanted to call Courtney and the girls. And also I do the finances in our relationship. And so I wanted to make sure that there were no bills that had come up that were now late that I needed to take care of. And also, I had like 2 weeks of emails to catch up on. And so I and before you knew it, I was on my device as much as I was beforehand. And all that I learned about how wonderful it is to be without that, like just out the window, I forgot. And that's part of being human. We forget about those important things that we learn. And we see this in the story of the Israelites. Whenever they escaped slavery, they quickly forgot the things that God had done for them. Whenever Moses had gone up to receive the 10 Commandments and the law, this is what they said. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come make gods for us." Like, forget about that one that was supposed to lead us out of Egypt. He's kind of let us hanging. Make new ones for us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Like whoever that guy was, Moses, I think was his name. Like I can't even remember him. I don't know. He had like a staff or something. Like it's like this is the guy who like raised his staff and the Red Sea parted and he led you out of slavery. And they're like, I don't know. Something, he like went to the store and never came back. Let's just move on, right? And these are the people who received manna and quail from God in the wilderness, and yet they forgot. And unfortunately, that's part of our human condition is we forget, and we need people who will remind us that you are a child of God, created in God's image, whom God dearly loves, and with whom God is well pleased. We have to have those people who remind us of those things. And whenever we do, wonderful things can happen in our lives. And so we started out like that. You can see 2 of us knew each other, not standing next to each other, John and me, and keeping a good distance from everybody. And the posture's a little bit different after 2 weeks in the wilderness, right? This crew had been through some stuff. Also, they smelled like they had been through some stuff. Thankfully, that does not come through. The dirt, fortunately, we're far enough out, you can't really see it. But whenever we go through those things together, when we stick it out, God can do amazing things through our community. If you have a friend, John and I have been best friends since high school, 25 years now. And God continues to bear amazing fruit through that relationship. Also, one of the cool things, like when in adulthood do you ever get to spend 2 straight weeks with a friend? Like never, it doesn't happen. It was an amazing gift. But that's the gift of relationship, and it happens whenever we stay, whenever we open the deepest parts of our lives that we want to keep to ourselves, and we allow God's grace to work. And there's an easiness that comes with long friendship, but it never gets easy. And if we really want to be in relationships, that is never something that we can just coast on. We have to always be willing to leave comfort to find life in Christ, to continue to make the hard decision of, I'm really comfortable right now, but I know the next step forward is going to be uncomfortable, and I'm going to take it anyway, because that's where God's calling me, and I know that God will meet me there. And that's what's possible when we live in community together. And so here's some action steps. I want to encourage you to take these this week. First, I want to think through who are the people who could have that kind of relationship with you, who could be the people who can tell you the hard truths, who in the middle of the night, if something happens that you can call and you know that they're going to show up. Who are those folks? And you might just think of them, and if you think of them, schedule a time to have a conversation and just Have the kind of conversation that deepens relationships. You can ask, how is it with your soul? That's the question that early Methodist small groups would ask. And amazing things can happen when you're willing to share at that level to deepen your relationship. If you don't have someone in your life that fits that category, first you might just start with praying about it, just asking God to show you who that person might be or to bring someone into your life. And I know that sounds a little bit cliche, but of course, like the preacher's saying, we should pray about it, right? But if we believe prayer changes things, that it actually makes a difference, then that's a great place to start. And then you can also come to Find Your Place. It'll be in August, the 11th, 18th, and 25th. It's something we do out in the gathering space, and we tell you about all the different opportunities that you have to connect, to find a study, a small group, people that you can do life with, and you can actually start forming the kinds of relationships that have that deep staying power. And there are people who talk about the people that they went through disciple Bible study with 10 or 15 years ago who still make an impact in their lives. It doesn't always happen, but whenever it does, it's amazingly powerful, and it doesn't happen if we don't show up. And so I want to invite you to try that. And then if you're feeling really brave, invite someone to dinner who's never been to your home before. And this is a little crazy. You might even not make sure that it's spotless. Actually let them see your house as it actually is in the way that you live in it. Because whenever we're willing to be vulnerable, amazing things can happen. Will you pray with me? God, I thank you for this community that you've called us into, that you've blessed us with, and through which you are transforming our hearts. I pray that you would continue to work in us, help us to say yes to being in relationship with you and with the people that you've put into our lives, even whenever it's hard, and then particularly in those difficult moments that you would help us to stay and to continue to do the kind of life together that you invite us to. We thank you for the way Jesus invites us into this community, for the way he models how to live it out, and that he taught us even how to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.